So the first question I obviously have to ask everyone is, who's excited about IE9? Come on, seriously, put up the hands. Now, of course I am, but I'm a little bit biased given that I work on the team. But to give myself a little bit more credibility, I've also been a web developer for quite a while. I actually started working on web pages about 12 years ago, and I've spent my fair share of time in the trenches figuring out and working around cross-browser differences and just getting things to work right everywhere my users are visiting my sites. Now, specifically today, I want to talk about a number of these best practices. Now, I'm curious, who attended Damien and Tatham's session on kind of, oh good, there's some people in the background there. They did some good discussion around progressive enhancement, graceful degradation. I'll focus on some more specific aspects in this presentation. Now, of course, as we all know, life as a web developer is a bit hard. And I'm specifically going to walk through cross-browser challenges for web developers, a set of do's, and a set of don'ts. Specifically, web developers have to deal with many different browsers: Firefox, IE, Safari, other flavors of WebKit. I apologize. What? Oh, thank you. Excuse me for just a second. Hopefully this will clear up the static. Better? Yeah. Fantastic. So yeah, IE, Firefox, many other different flavors of WebKit, many different versions of each of those browsers. And new versions are released frequently. In the last year alone, every single major browser vendor released a new version. And this becomes somewhat of a challenge for dealing with this moving platform, this moving target that you want to get your websites to run on. But it's a key goal of the IE team to help you enable that. That's why we've been talking so much about the same markup, getting your same HTML, JavaScript, and CSS to run that you can use in the other browsers. And I'll go into a lot more of the specifics about how that works. Oh, wrong direction. So first, I actually want to jump straight into a demo with a new feature. Are most people here familiar with rounded corners from CSS3? Good. I just want to kind of show you what the experience today is in that case. So I've got the IE9 platform preview, Firefox, Opera, Chrome, and Safari. And I've just set up kind of a basic page with a div, some borders, and what I want to go do is add some rounded borders to my site. So if I go in here to edit, I've left myself a little to-do. Now, given that I've read the CSS spec, I'm going to go ahead and just add border radius, and I'll set it to something like 20 pixels. Now, the interesting question becomes how this works when I go and actually test this across different browsers. So I'll refresh in IE9, and I get rounded corners like I expect. In Chrome, I get the same. But as I move across some of the different browser implementations and refresh, you'll see that Opera does as well, but I'm not getting my rounded corners on Safari and Firefox. Now, people that have dealt with this before are well aware that vendors that do early adoption typically use vendor prefixes. And so, since Firefox and Safari have actually had early support of rounded borders, I need to use their vendor prefixed versions to get it to work, as they haven't supported the unprefixed version yet. So with that change, I should be pretty good to go ahead and load up. And now I've got my rounded corners. So fairly simple. Now, what if I want to do something a little bit more complex? How many people are aware that you can actually set each individual border individually? Great. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm just going to set like 5, 5, 50, 50. And I'll just copy this over so that each different syntax has it. Now let's go back and check what that looks like in the browsers. So I've got the 2 5s at the top, the 50s at the bottom in IE. Same in Firefox, Opera, and Chrome. But in Safari, I didn't quite get what I expected. That's because there's more different between these properties than simply having a vendor prefix. They actually have slightly different levels of support for syntax. Now, this is what we were talking about before, where standards are sometimes a bit of a moving target before they've been fully ratified. And so when some of these prefixes have been introduced, the standards were at a different stage and different forms of the syntax weren't supported. So to actually go ahead and get this to work in Safari, I have to go and break them out into 4 separate statements. Now, I won't make you watch me write all that, so I've saved up a nice little copy here. But if I go and do that replacement, then I can get the behavior that I'm looking for. All right, so my key point is this. Working with different features in different browsers, even with the latest standards, is a hard problem. Like, browsers adopt things at different rates, and they're going to have differences in their implementations until things stabilize over time. But there are things that you can do as a web developer to help shield yourself against those differences. Now, the key point of this really comes down to how you choose what you're going to run where. The CSS example I just showed works quite nicely due to the way that CSS naturally does fallback. The browsers just pick up on what they support, and they ignore what they don't. But when you're working with something in script, which is often more commonly the case, you generally are doing a more explicit detection. And this is really what matters most when we're talking about the same markup, determining what your site's actually going to use depending on where it's running. Now, early on, a lot of people would use what we call version detection. They'd go, okay, I know that this browser supports this set of features, and so I'm going to go ahead and detect what browser it is, use the features I know it supports, and then keep doing that for each browser in my test matrix. Now, the specific thing here is that what you end up with are pieces of codes specifically targeted at given browser implementations. Now, we moved on to something called object detection, where instead of perhaps looking at the user agent string, we would end up looking at different objects that we knew one browser had over or another. Document.all has been a clear indication of IE for some time. But you're still effectively doing the same thing. It's browser-specific, browser-targeted code. Now, what's come up in more recent years as a strong recommendation is to do something called feature detection. This is where you're actually looking not for a specific browser, but for whether that browser you're currently running in supports the feature you want to use. So in this case, I'm not looking for browser X and browser Y. I'm checking whether a browser supports add event listener, and then falling back to some alternative code that I have in cases where it doesn't. Now, this brings me to the set of best practices that I'm really wanting to get across as part of this presentation. Specifically, that you, when you're writing your site, should do feature detection and what I refer to as behavior detection. It's just a more specialized form. I'll get into more detail later. And specifically, avoid detecting specific browsers or assuming unrelated features, because just because a browser has feature X and Y today doesn't necessarily mean new browsers that add X are going to add Y at the same time. The key thing here is the impact is it reduces your own maintenance cost on your sites. With browser detection, you don't know what the next version is going to hold. And so you're always playing a guessing game in terms of, well, when the next version of IE or Firefox comes out, do I still need to send it down this code path or do I need to send it down the other one? With feature detection, you can automatically